if there had only ever been one canonical Link? But his story dated back 20,000 years, and had been passed down from order to order betwixt cyclical wars and natural disasters. Perhaps his story would go something like this.
Long ago, when the world was young, a fearsome entity threatened to plunge all the land into darkness. Many rose to challenge this foe, yet none prevailed until at last a young warrior of mysterious origin appeared, wielding a shining sword. With the help of his spirit companions, he had entered the lost sacred grove within the Forbidden Wood to recover an ancient blade of legend, said to be created by the goddess Hylia herself. Wait, I thought he got it from Hyrule's distant skyborn ancestors, the Skyloftians. Well, actually it was technically made by the Minish, who were a tiny childlike race that coexisted with the Hylians. But, they lived in a magical wood, but originally they came from the sky. And wasn't the hero one of them also, or something like that? Well, he wasn't technically one of them. He was a Hylian, but he was affiliated with them, and he could pass himself off as one of them. My bro said he was a shapeshifter. He could turn into a rabbit. No, it was a wolf. Well, in some versions of the tale, he could become other people, other species, and even change his own size. And sometimes people turned into seagulls. I heard he was a master of disguises and a sworn member of each of the tribes he encountered. Right, but before that, he was just an ordinary boy, wasn't he? An orphan farm boy or something like that, raised by his grandpa? Or was it his grandma? No, it was his uncle. Well, the version I heard suggested that he lived alone. He was raised by a tree. I think that was the ancient unnamed ancestor or something like that, but the hero of legend lived among other Hylians. Well, if that's true, then they both did. Actually, our hero lived near the magical wood. Well, sort of. He lived near one magical wood, but not inside it. And the legendary woods were actually kind of far away, to the northwest. Or wasn't that the southeast? Well, wherever it was, the legendary sword slept there in that forest. Wait, I think it was actually inside Hylia's temple, wasn't it? Well, to be exact, the temple itself was once inside the forest, and the hero found the sword in its ruins. Also, the forest which housed Hylia's temple was indeed to the south. Yeah, that was Faron Woods. The one to the northwest was Lost Woods. But the Lost Woods were definitely where the sword lay hidden. Yes, but not at first. Originally the temple was in the sky, and then it fell into Faron Woods. And then that part of the forest eventually became Hyrule, and likely got gradually rezoned as the Hylian race developed. And then the trees must have taken parts of it over again through the ages. Which is why there are so many little patches of fairy-infested spirit woods in Hyrule to this day. I think they built a ranch, among other things, where part of Faron Woods used to be, not all that far from where the temple fell. And if I recall correctly, our hero was actually living in a village which formed somewhere around that same ranch, or kind of. Actually, Ordon sort of grew out of the village where the little people used to dwell, but his mighty steed was tended at the ranch. Right, and his true love tended to that steed. What was her name again? Elia? No, it was Malin. Or was it Marin? Actually, I believe the hero had many loves, did he not? Among them a dream-born maiden of the ocean. And also the Princess Zelda herself? Well, actually no. The hero was merely Zelda's knight, and almost every prospective bride was more or less one kind of impermanent distraction or another. Wait, I actually thought our hero was far too young to be distracted by romance. Wasn't he 8 or something? Well, at first, yes, but then he grows up throughout the tale, and he even travels the world, having one adventure after another. I can't remember if it's before or after he defeats Ganon, but he gets in this little boat and takes to the sea, and he visits many places. Right, doesn't he travel from kingdom to kingdom, restoring balance and saving townsfolk? And then there's this whole other series of journeys which takes place on the ocean, and then he somehow loses his way or something like that. And in the meantime, Hyrule is in peril, but it's being protected by some magical seal, and the hero messes with that seal at some point, doesn't he? And then, after all his hardships, due to Ganon's cunning, he was eventually defeated in combat, pretending the fall of the kingdom. Oh, right, and he is sent into the future, and there are clones of him as a result. And with magical technology, careful planning, loads and loads of time travel, and the help of his various allies and spirit companions, he and his allies manage to spare Hyrule and prepare for the final showdown.
As you can see, there are a lot of crossed wires in the series. But it's not just the plot points which overlap and repeat themselves. In fact, the very fabric of the mythos is kaleidoscopic in nature. Though repetition and reincarnation are major themes within the Zelda series, over time its DNA steadily changed. The series has mutated, transitioned, and multiplied. In some ways, the games have remained very much the same, but by the same token, at this point they barely resemble their predecessors. Now, Nintendo's technological capabilities and fanbase have gradually expanded, and new content has steadily emerged alongside recycled content. The series has also developed some rather pedantic elements. Meticulously categorized parallel worlds and nether regions, divergent timelines, dogmatic expression, and even overt canonization. Somewhere along the way in this massive, self-referential franchise, Canonization started to seem not only natural for some fans, but even necessary. And just like that, it was transformed from fantasy to full-blown mythology, with aspects of the series sidling up against or even outright merging with prominent icons within the zeitgeist. So, this raises the question, does canonization matter? And, honestly, I can't answer that question. It's not that simple, at least not anymore. This is no longer just a toy at this point. Legend of Zelda has become so much more to so many people that many of us could confidently claim that we'd be entirely different people if the games had never found their way to us. So I want to say that canonization matters insofar as Zelda exists as mythology inside the minds of the players. But even in that context, some of us care less about the official timeline than others, regardless of what we perceive to have been Nintendo's true motivations for introducing said timeline. Whether we consciously recognize it or not, each Zelda fan experiences a personalized, mental version of Hyrule, complete with blind spots, psychological projections, ascribed meanings, assumptions about how everything inside and outside of Hyrule fits together, and even personal judgments about which games, characters, or side quests even deserve to belong to the franchise. Now, there are a couple reasons for this, some more personal than others. One consideration is the relationship between preference and expectation. Which title did I play first? How old was I when I first saw the game? What year was it? Which, if any, console generations happened to closely coincide with some of my most poignant life experiences? What other fantasy adaptations might have already preloaded me with positive expectations? Was I expecting to experience something new? What was I secretly hoping would be different? What was I secretly hoping would ultimately remain familiar? Many of us would like to believe that the order in which we played or otherwise experienced the Zelda titles had no meaningful bearing on our ability to assess their objective worth, but this is rarely the case. Even within its own context, Link's tale has been passed down through the ages from orator to orator, assimilating modern sensibilities and pertinent thematic shorthand, but this is also true of the games themselves, which have evolved to meet the standards and expectations of an ever-changing, rapidly aging audience. And in a more abstract sense, the developers are reiterating Link's various ordeals through the metaphorical lenses of the hardware, hiring new staff as the core developer teams come and go, and creating, refurbishing, and just outright cutting and pasting assets. In that sense, Legend of Zelda is very much like a fairy tale, being told from a retrospective or even revisionist point of view. Through that lens, each installment could perhaps be described as an externalized version of the same tale as perceived through the eyes of a different child, some versions dwelling more on the adventure, others on the characters, or even on Link himself. As a general rule, the more complex the myth and the more detailed and meticulous the canonization, the more vehemently contested the interpretations and meanings of said myth tend to be. And as the consensus regards and examines the lore of a given universe at ever-accelerating rates, arguing amongst itself about legitimate versus illegitimate interpretations, the lines between fairy tale, myth, and folklore rapidly begin to blur. Which is why I personally prefer to place a greater emphasis on the message rather than the medium, because much of what's actually being communicated is more or less the same. It's simply a story about a young hero who ended perilous conflict by finding courage within his heart and more or less behaving in a virtuous manner. Well, it's the way everything's broken down, classified, and contextualized that sets hero stories apart. Whether they're myth cycles, fairy tales, religious sagas, or even just run-of-the-mill fantasy fiction. It's our obsession with numbers, with archetypes, with attributing meanings and drawing connections that inclines us to complexify these stories, because, generally speaking, the more meaning we're able to find in a given tale, the more it tends to permeate our consciousness, and the more we can suspend our disbelief and subsequently take its message to heart. Which is why I'm going to try my best to break down the relationships between the gods, avatars, and archetypes within the Zelda series. Though its rigid canonization may not seem entirely relevant or even literal for some of us, we can still enrich our experience of the series by drawing some of these connections for ourselves. So, in the previous episode, I referred to the Zoras, Gorons, and various forest child races as the elemental races of Hyrule. I'll now include human, animalistic, and magical races in this model, and all that falls betwixt. In addition to the land-dwelling human-ish peoples, we have what are presently water-dwelling peoples, forest-dwelling peoples, mountain-dwelling peoples, and sky-dwelling peoples. And then there are some really weird overlaps with their genetic, environmental, and elemental affiliations, implied and canonical alike. For instance, in Skyward Sword, the Pirella are connected to the Zoras and the water dragon deity, yet they also reside within a forest region and are implied to be connected with Furore rather than Neru, who is usually associated with water. Then, of course, we have the Rito, who are technically associated with wind, earth, fire, and water. They're connected with the wind since they can fly and use wind-based abilities. They are connected to Fire and Wind Waker, since they live on a volcano and are connected with both Din and the Fire Dragon. They're connected with Earth and Wind Waker, since the Fire Dragon's attendant is the Sage of the Earth Temple. And they're connected with Water, since they allegedly share a common ancestry with Zoras. And also the Pirella, according to that. Does this all need to be canonized? I think not. Now, whether or not their affiliations and correspondences are static, and I mean their affiliations don't technically have to be static for any meaningful reason, there are at least some elements which remain fairly consistent, and the rest can perhaps be explained by cultural fusion, which I'll get into more in a little while. One thing I'll note is that the patently elemental races are almost always affiliated with nature-themed demigods, or other giant wild organisms. Their cultures appear to have some animistic and shamanic elements, which still exist within the human cultures, but are expressed somewhat differently. Their gods and avatars, at least the effigies we've seen of them, tend to be humanoid in appearance, Usually, though not always, they appear to worship the triumvirate somewhat indirectly while striving to serve Hylia, the triumvirate's avatar of peace and goodness, more directly. Curiously enough, the elemental races demonstrate an extremely tangible and direct connection with the all-powerful triumvirate in favor of Hylia, but more on that in a little while. Of course, all the divine entities in the Zelda series are seemingly given their dues, including the manifold spirits and sacred animals which govern the natural world. But in spite of their differences, all of these races tend to intermingle. Or at the very least, it is hinted at that they have coexisted in the past. Because of this, we see many of the same symbols all over Hyrule. We see iterations of the Sheikah Eye, some occasional astrological motifs which appear to be of Gerudo origin, many versions of these same three goddess symbols, and a couple other things such as the red bird symbol, also known as the Loftwing, mysterious, unexplained gods and figureheads and simulacrum of prominent, established characters. We also see many of the same kinds of objects in numerous places, regardless of the cultures attached to them. I mean, some of this is obviously due to hardware limitations and reused assets, especially in the 2D games, but some of it is also clearly intentional. Of course, the most common emblem, which is featured heavily in every single culture, is the Triforce, which of course represents the three golden goddesses. Now, in order to unpack what is really a rich philosophy contained within the idea of the Triforce itself, I think it's necessary to understand the old gods who created it. But first, let me get Hylia and Demise out of the way. Hylia, who is the patron goddess of the Hylian people, was officially named in Skyward Sword. Her presence is sort of implied in the earlier games, insofar as it is established that the Hylian royal family was originally chosen by the gods to guard the Triforce of Wisdom, or the whole Triforce, depending on the game. Her role is mainly to care for the Hylians in particular, though she is also strongly connected with the Sheikah, who serve said royal family, and therefore Hylia herself. She is also acknowledged and allied with the other races of Hyrule, who generally adhere to her wishes. Her spirit, as implied in Skyward Sword and onward, inhabits each iteration of Princess Zelda. But even in earlier games, the Hylian royal family are depicted as having potent supernatural abilities. Demise, on the other hand, is basically the Morgoth of the Zelda franchise, existing as a seed of discord and the root of Ganon's malice. The relationship between Demise and Ganon is somewhat poorly defined in the series, especially since Ganon's relationship with Ganondorf and the other warlords isn't ever fully explained. But my best guess is that Ganon, not to be confused with Ganondorf, and Demise are essentially the same entity under different aliases, the former being christened later in the hypothetical timeline after the supposed first warlord to successfully unleash its power, Ganondorf. But Ganondorf is not the only antagonist in the series to assume the iconic Ganon form. There are also other warlords, such as Aghanim and Yuga, who transform into demonic pig beasts. And then we have the antagonists who assume slightly more unique beast forms, some of which do not closely resemble Ganon. And it's unclear whether this apparent beastification process adheres to any kind of logical consistency or hierarchy, at least in the official sense. Though I will note that all the villains who aren't Ganondorf and don't take some variation of this final form either exist outside of Hyrule, are subordinate to an actual version of Ganondorf, or exist before the first Ganondorf in the official timeline. My guess is that, aside from entities such as Majora and the Nightmare, who seem to hail from alternate realities, all the villains are either pawns, vessels, or proxies of Demise, and maybe it's even possible that Majora and its ilk are at the very least equivalent to Demise, though very little is known about these entities. Take that with a grain of salt, though. I think the most important detail here is that these power-hungry warlords all transform, and regardless of their methods, and whether or not Ganondorf the man is involved, it is conceivable that these end bosses are all versions of the same ultimate evil, which, of course, uses whatever avenues are available in order to materialize. In my previous video, I implied that the essences of power and wisdom were held in equilibrium by the essence of courage. In this same way, Demise and Hylia whether literal characters within a literal timeline or just vague concepts loosely woven into the fabric of the franchise, are sort of like personifications of chaos and order, locked in an eternal struggle. And Link is the avatar of balance, a divine keeper of fate, at times upholding peace in a gregarious manner, at other times wielding the wrath of Zeus. These three avatars, in their exalted forms, are sort of like imperfect, worldly manifestations of the divine triple goddess. Essentially, they're a triumvirate on a lower octave. And since Hyrule and its surrounding lands are literally brimming with lesser, imperfect expressions of these three immortal virtues, rigid canonization becomes slightly less important than the loose dynamics, characteristics, and interplay of said virtues as they are expressed within the mortal realms. The main deities in the franchise are, of course, Din, Neru, and Furor, respectively the goddesses of power, wisdom, and courage, as defined in Ocarina of Time. Each corresponding to a portion of the Triforce, they are the curators of the sacred realm, and original creators of the material world, and possibly existence in general, depending on how we choose to interpret the myth. They seem relatively straightforward, but despite their rather emblematic titles, there is more to each of them than courage, power, or wisdom. Not unlike goddesses in real-world mysticism, the supreme beings of Hylian legend have multiple functions, facets, and individual traits. This is reflected not only in their various idols and depictions throughout the series, but also in the creatures, lesser gods, oracles, fairies, sages, priests, and spirits affiliated with them, which are usually organized into tidy little groups of 3, but not always.
There will also be more on that a bit later in this video.
In the Zelda universe, as well as being personifications of power, wisdom, and courage, the goddesses are also creators of the known world, conceiving, forming, and nurturing the land. Din, the creator of the land, could perhaps be seen as the creator of physical existence. Then there is Neru, who supposedly created law, a vague statement to be sure, seeing as it could refer to a number of things, including physical, magisterial, or moralistic laws, or perhaps all 3. At a glance, I would assume that Neru's law is mainly the laws of physics, or to put it another way, the underpinnings or code language of physical reality. But from examining the personalities of the various entities associated with her and her Triforce piece, I would have to guess that morality and ethics, or perhaps more aptly, philosophy, are also the domain of Neru. Other functions under the umbrella of Neru could perhaps also be reason and logic, extending therefore into the sciences and maybe even into the arts. She is the goddess of enlightenment, so to speak, bestowing the gifts of mind, self-awareness, knowledge, and intellect. So, in this hypothetical system, Neru, the superconscious force of wisdom, therefore molds and regulates Din's unadulterated chaos, which may otherwise have existed as unconscious universal space. While Din is the generator of existence as we know it, Neru is a refining edge, the keeper of physical space, as dreamed up in Din's cosmic womb. Now, if we examine the two goddesses, it becomes clear that each being seems to rely on the other to exist. They're a duality of essence and substance, of thought and form, of omniscience and omnipotence. This duality between them is reflected in the Oracle games, their humanoid avatars seeming to convey opposing sides of the same spectrum. Both are performers, a dancer and a musician. Both are sought by ambitious villains and abducted in relatively the same way. Both pretend a distortion of time. The only real differences between them are that one seems more wild and spontaneous, like the scattering of seasons throughout the land, and the other seems more ordered and composed, like a tidy schism in time.
But you might be wondering, where exactly does Furor fit into this triumvirate?
Well, the first thing that I feel should be pointed out is that Furor, and everything attached to her or associated with her, often seems to exist on the sidelines, at least at a glance. There's the Oracle of Secrets, who is barely involved in either of the Oracle games. In fact, even conversing with her is optional. And I know I've already touched upon this in my other videos a fair bit, but there's also Link, whose homeland in some cases is not even technically considered to be an official part of Hyrule.
in contrast to the other prestigious royal Triforce bearers, only when Link comes of age is it directly stated that he has the blood of the hero within him, and his identity up until that point is kept relatively discreet, perhaps intentionally so. But nonetheless, Farore's connection to the other goddesses runs deep. As the implied creator of biological organisms, after Din and Nehru collectively dreamed and created the world, Farore populated it. So not only is she, in one sense anyway, the creator of mortal life, but her designated muse is the Oracle of Secrets, or to put it another, fancier way, the Keeper of Mysteries. Pondering these terms had left me with a question. What is the relationship between the themes of courage, secrets, mystery, fostering life, and upholding law? And how does this fit into the grand schematic? Well, one thing that is well established is the fact that her Triforce bearer is upholding the law in accordance with some kind of ancient design, which of course inevitably spells the reconciling of all three virtues. It seems to me that Farore's prime directive is to protect all life, and thus, according to Nehru's decree,
or by proxy, Hylia's decree, if we want to get all technical and canon about it.
She accomplishes this feat by appointing Link as an avatar. Now, mystery, similarly to wisdom, can be interpreted in a few different ways. It can be read spiritually, psychologically, or abstractly, for instance. But, however one chooses to characterize Farore's subset of virtues, perceiving and discovering the unknown seems to be a common thread. Perhaps then curiosity could also be part of what this Triforce and its appropriately childlike goddess aspect partially represent, as it is among our deepest of biological yearnings to learn, grow, and experiment. Mystery is a very human concept.
Said curiosity and other profoundly human emotions are therefore what bridge mystery, or secrets if you will, to courage, Farore's titular domain.
In that sense, she is the goddess of humanity at large, which is, of course, merely one tree within a vast network of mortal organisms, which are neither wholly conscious nor wholly unconscious. The domain of courage might seem rather different from those of power and wisdom, in that it's a quality typically associated more readily with mortal beings than with omnipotent or omniscient deities. But Farore's innate role as the nurturer and protector of life forms suits this assignment quite well. In classical mythology from around the world, courage as a jurisdiction is frequently associated with deities who are more directly involved in interactive human affairs, such as wars, marriages, adventures, trials, or acts of justice. These deities are, of course, often affiliated either directly or indirectly with mythical heroes or godlike mortal saviors, and this makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, if you think about it, in a given universe, the mortal animal spheres in which humanoid beings exist tend to be realms filled with fear and suffering. Therefore, the most poignant stories associated with superhumans and savior deities tend to involve subjects pertaining to things like death, rebirth, initiation, existential conflict, survival, and metamorphosis. Conversely, mythological beings which connect viscerally with extremely arcane subjects, such as enlightenment, fate, physics, and time, tend not to interact with ordinary mortals on a regular basis, unless of course these mortals demonstrate their worthiness in some arcane manner. So, in summary, the duality of the original two forces comprise the ebb and flow of ages, the turning of the wheels of fate in cyclical strife and profusion, the swaying of the cosmic pendulum, and the echoes of destiny. And of course, Farore, our heart-centric goddess, protects and sponsors the divinely gifted perceivers of Hyrule's lushest and bitterest seasons alike. Farore, the goddess whose creations uphold Nehru's law, can be seen as a complex being in comparison to the other two, neither representative of substance nor essence intrinsically, but instead existing to populate the world with conscious beings. Farore might, therefore, also be perceived as the personification of consciousness. And we see these kinds of patterns in relationships all over the series, and just in life more generally. Chemistry, physics, and biology. Substance, essence, life. Unconsciousness, superconsciousness, and consciousness. id, superego, and ego. In Kabbalistic terms, form, matter energy, and awareness, or the pillars of severity, mercy, and mildness. Is all this stuff I just mentioned canon in the literal sense? Absolutely not. But decoding the systems and relationships baked into the series can help us to better understand the core formula, or seed if you will, which renders the ever-changing kaleidoscope that is Hyrule.
More on the kaleidoscope thing later.
Because determining what is truly canon in a giant work of modern mythology requires that we strip away the layers and look deeper, that we search for what is meaningfully consistent, and allow ourselves to consider that everything else has grown out of that seed, guided by a perpetually fluctuating array of variables.
But, weirdly, trifecta associations and affiliations do not perfectly map onto one another throughout the series, even though the games are dogmatically repetitive.
For instance, there are great fairies of power, courage, and wisdom in some of the games, but there is also a quote-unquote great fairy of magic, just as there is also a fourth land spirit in Twilight Princess, and a bunch of other pattern-breaking divisions tacked onto the sides of what would otherwise be tidy symmetry. Most frequently, the games use 7s, and kinda also 6s to represent the sages and wise men, 3s to represent the goddesses, and when it's 6 sages it seems once again to be symmetrical with the goddesses. It's more like 6 sages plus 1, and 4s also come up pretty often in the series. Then there are the truly unique divisions. In Breath of the Wild we have not 3, 6, 7, or even 4, but 8 legendary heroines in the Gerudo Desert. Though once again, it's not 8, but 7 plus 1. They are associated with ostensibly nothing else within the mythos of the series.
But that would be silly.
In Wind Waker, there are 2 important sages rather than 7, each representing totally different elements from their predecessors, occupying the wind and earth temples respectively, in addition to the legacy fire, forest, and water-themed dungeons. Kinda. Of course, whenever we leave Hyrule, we see a bunch of discrepancies, such as the 4 giants in Majora's Mask, or the 8 instruments in Link's Awakening, though perhaps this makes a little more sense in foreign lands, where the gods and the general spiritual situation possibly differs from that of Hyrule. Of course, this is also true to an extent with some of the races who actually dwell within Hyrule. Though the distinction between god, demigod, and patron spirit is flimsy at best in the Zelda universe, which raises the question, how closely are the entities connected with one another? And once again, how static are these relationships and correspondences truly?
And of course, how relevant is the distinction between the author's intent and the end product? Should we care about retcons, scrapped content, last-minute changes, and marketing decisions?
For example, in Wind Waker, the developers were planning on making a 3rd water-themed dungeon where Great Fish Isle is situated, rather than just having Jabun hand over Neru's pearl right after Link visits the ruins. With that in mind, I believe it's at least conceivable that, along with all the other scrapped content, they were also planning on featuring a 3rd sage before running out of disk space and being forced to cut content. Maybe it was this guy. Maybe this is what Gorons would have evolved into if there had been enough space on the GameCube discs. Though, this is obviously all just wild speculation. The presence of a 3rd sage could have changed the way the respective sages' assignments were delegated, or at the very least, created a separate little group of 3. So, for instance, you've got your forest, fire, and water, your shadow, spirit, and light, and maybe wind, earth, and something else, such as ice, or time, or slime? Or maybe there only need to be 8 elements in Zelda. You've got your traditional 4 elements, then you've got your more ethereal, magical elements, representing rebirth, death, total empowerment, and total enlightenment. And or the 9th is destiny, or maybe destiny and time are the same thing, kind of the element which is greater than the sum of its parts. This is the problem with rigid canonization. Sometimes it just gets too speculative and pedantic. Honestly, I think that the simplest and most elegant explanation is that the goddesses simply organize themselves into whichever divisions, elemental systems, and realms best serve the needs of the moment.
Another, bolder explanation is that within the context of myth and spiritual affairs, spirit simply is as spirit does, and any math we perceive therein is ultimately an arbitrary grid, merely a tool we use to try to explain the unexplainable.
And of course, nothing in the franchise is completely homogeneous. Zelda is brave, Link is strong, and Ganon is cunning. All of the dungeons demand power, wisdom, and courage. Sometimes the Zoras bury their dead in Kakariko. Sometimes the desert is more closely associated with Naru than with Din. Sometimes Farore's foresty stuff is windy, or watery, or electrified. With that in mind, I wish to share something I've noticed within the series, something slightly more psychological, which indirectly involves the three virtues, as well as Link's reiterative, elementally themed trials. In the games with this model, with 3 novice dungeons followed by however many adult higher level dungeons, at least in the games which go heavy on the story, there is actually a discernible pattern to Link's outer and inner journey, which sort of maps onto the Triforce virtues. This is the pattern. The game starts with disillusionment, which is courage. Link is ripped from his ignorant bliss. He goes into his first ever dungeon. He usually loses someone very important to him immediately before or after said dungeon, and he goes far away from his home, somewhere within that same stretch of time. Now, we actually see this pattern repeated 3 times in Ocarina of Time, which I'll explain in a moment, but it's always most conspicuous in the first 3 acts. Speaking of which, the second act is empowerment. Within what has now proven to be an incredibly strange and foreign world, the young warrior is given a taste of real adventure. By this point, he fancies himself a capable warrior. To prove it, he's awarded some fancy adult toys, a fancy bracelet, or some other obstacle-defying ability, which he employs adroitly. Now, the third act is transformation, or in other words, wisdom. In the third act, Link is shown that his strength alone will not help him. He is reminded of his innocence once again, and is awarded with some means of transcending his current circumstances. We see aspects of these 3 acts even in some of the older games which don't fit this model, or at least not in the same way. For instance, in Majora's Mask, we still have our first 3 forest, fire, and water dungeons, more or less, which respectively make Link face the world in spite of his weakness, experience superior physical ability, and then live through grown-up concerns which are beyond his experience. This is not dissimilar from what I like to refer to as the fleshy, nervous puberty dungeon within the belly of the whale. Inside Jabu Jabu's belly, Link's strength and courage cannot help him to navigate the confusing pathways and layers without relying on mental abilities. He is also confronted with the prospects of flirting, love, commitment, and even marriage, all of which likely throw him for a loop at his tender age, which, speaking of transformation, is about to be magically altered. I'll note that the first 3 acts of Link's Awakening also follow a similar trend, even though the overall arc is a little less structured. The first act, again, is disillusionment, when the owl insinuates that Koholint Island is simply a dream. The second act awards him once again with a power bracelet, and right after the third dungeon, he's able to retrieve the ocarina from the Dream Shrine, and is directly confronted with the eventual choice to wake up from a dream which is, by all appearances, better than real life, or simply remain asleep. Now, Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword are basically the only Zelda games which allow a player to experience the patterns of disillusionment, empowerment, and transformation repeatedly on escalating octaves. In Ocarina, once Link grows up, we're contacted by the same 3 elemental races in the same order, but this time, the lessons are much harder. After his rebirth, he loses the ability to use most of his weapons and is once again a novice. He is also disillusioned when he re-enters the world to find that everything familiar has changed, and mainly for the worse. The forest dungeon also challenges his courage in a major way. Where the first forest dungeon had assailed him with giant spiders, a classic symbol of fear. The next one assails him with terrifying undead creatures and other spectacularly unsettling illusions, which would undoubtedly shatter whatever might have been left of his sense of normalcy.
Then he finds out that his real parents are dead and that he was adopted. You know, it's a bad scene.
Next he goes to the Fire Temple, where his stamina is tested like never before. Mountain climbing, breathing in hot fumes, fire blasting at him at every turn, wielding the Megaton Hammer, fighting a dragon single-handedly in a sweltering hot chamber. Ordinarily, for anyone but a Goron, this act would be virtually impossible, but he endures. Of course, he thinks he's got the world all figured out, until the Water Temple. The entire sixth act is, of course, a transformation of epic proportions, when, after spending hour upon in-game hour navigating what is considered by many fans to be one of the most confusing dungeons of all time, all before confronting the proverbial dweller on the threshold. In order to win this fight, Link is forced to transcend his own ability, to become stronger, wiser, and overall more adept during the battle.
He thinks he's done. He thinks the Water Temple is over. What could possibly be worse?
Why, the most staggering, soul-crushing, heart-stabbing disillusionment of all. Possibly the most metal pair of dungeons in any Zelda game. Link must first go to the bottom of a zombie-infested, acid-filled, corpse-ridden well, complete with murder and torture scenes, demoralizing traps, and the creepiest mini-boss in the franchise. And if that wasn't frightening enough, Link has to do this as a child, after he has finally gotten used to being a much stronger, wiser, more empowered adult. Then he has to go to the Shadow Temple, which is basically a much scarier, longer version of the Well Dungeon. Again, this is a test of his courage, complete with crazy leaps of faith, a dramatic theme of separating reality from lies, and learning about the darkest and most hideous truths, and looking death square in the eye. The Shadow Temple is the ultimate disillusionment, accessible and likely survivable only for those who have mastered the darkness within themselves. The final temple in Ocarina of Time is, of course, the Spirit Temple, which I believe is representative of the highest octave of power. The Spirit Temple, rather than simply demanding physical prowess, requires both replete skill and a strength of will. The temple's sage, Naboru, bends to the superior force of its keeper, Twinrova, when her will crumbles in the grip of their ancient power. Twinrova also behaves in a seductive manner toward Link, perhaps, whether this was done intentionally or not, implying the seductive nature of power, and the peril therein. In addition to the temple itself, in this 8th act, Link encounters several men who have succumbed to temptation and lost their freedom as a result, and the entire Gerudo region sort of implies that the weak lose their freedom to the strong the very moment their personal integrity wavers. And then the 9th act, of course, imparts the final wisdom afforded only to the purest and most devout. In this case, they are Rauru, the official leader of the sages, Zelda, the unofficial leader of the sages and secret 7th member, and Link himself. In this act, the highest order is achieved, after which point the hero is at last permitted to confront the lowest chaos.
Skyward Sword offers a much simpler model, though very similar thematically.
Firstly, we have the loss of Link's closest friend, followed by his descent into the world below, where he discovers that his life up until that point had been comparatively tiny and insignificant. This, along with the giant spider-infested Skyview Temple and initial confrontation with Girahim, is his first poignant disillusionment and act of bravery. Secondly, we have his empowerment chapter, when he gets to the Elden region, once more a fire level preceded by a forest level, and is allowed to go off the rails slightly more than he was before. After scaling steep, grueling mountain terrain, the subsequent temple demands feats of acrobatic prowess that would give an Olympian medalist a panic attack.
So what does the 3rd act throw at Link? Ambiguity, time travel, and puzzles galore. So in other words, a wisdom challenge.
And
Even though the Lanera Desert is only really a water level by proxy, a patience challenge. A major patience challenge, the entire way through. And, in my opinion, a convoluted, drawn-out, confusing nightmare that puts the water temple to shame. So, after experiencing time travel and obtaining the mystical goddess harp, what does Link next experience in Act 4? Disillusionment. All his fears are confirmed, and then he is initiated into the spirit world, an undertaking which mirrors his first descent into the realms below. Later, within the exquisitely beautiful, and, I might add, incredibly original Ancient Cistern level, he finds further disillusionment. He is reminded that things are not always as they appear, that sometimes leaps of faith are rewarded with horrors, even though we must descend into the unknown, whether or not we want to. Because whensoever we think we've come to understand the nature of a thing, it all too often turns out that we basically know nothing of what lurks around the bend. What life will spring on us the second we're starting to get comfortable. Of course, then the pattern is sort of broken by switching the ordering of the next tier Elden and Lanera dungeons. But nonetheless, I would still say that this chapter emphasizes physical prowess with its labor-themed mole myths and unforgiving terrain, while this dungeon emphasizes metamorphosis. With its magical time journey, its mentally challenging time travel-themed dungeon, and its giant creature of the deep. And then, of course, it's rinse and repeat. The player has to redo those same 3 stages a third time, and do a bunch of drawn-out chores to complete the goddess song. So, there is often a repetitive pattern where the dungeons and elements are concerned. At least in many of the games. And even in a couple of the games which tried to break up this pattern, it seems likely that the pattern was only really shifted for the sake of diversity.
And on that note, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there are sort of official and unofficial dungeons in many of the titles.
Official dungeons are thematically weighty, usually affiliated directly with the main gods, sages, guardians, elemental races, medallions, and whatnot. These places sometimes feel as though they were put there specifically for Link to find. The unofficial dungeons are more places where powerful treasures or important characters just happen to be, which either don't reward Link with a divine relic in the first place, or if they do, it feels kind of like the relic was placed there accidentally. Or perhaps relocated there from a more conspicuous location. Some examples are the Snow Peak ruins, which is just an abandoned fortress that later got dungeonified, likely due to the presence of the Twilight. The Ice Cavern, which, as far as we know, is simply a place where the iron boots were stowed for safekeeping, and the Wind Ruins, which, in all fairness, used to be a prominent location, before its keepers migrated to the Cloudtop region. But then, even within these non-elemental and side-quest dungeons, there is a discernible sense of importance. Even within many of the seemingly unthemed, unaligned locations in the series. Many of them appear to house statues of forgotten gods, facsimiles of unnamed important entities and other prominent simulacra. The thing is, that's sort of how the great fairies, god archetypes, and other prominent mystical figures in the series seem to me. We're basically in a world teeming with light spirits, nature gods, demigods, yokai, demons, and other kami. Some of them are thematically fine-tuned, such as the dragons in Breath of the Wild or the Deku Tree. Others exist in some unspecified place within the cosmic web, such as the Maku Tree,
Levias, and the Windfish. I would say that the main difference between all of these guys and the Triumvirate is that these patron nature gods are corruptible. Even the great fairies and light spirits are vulnerable to Ganon's powers, and are sometimes shown as withered, transfigured, shattered, or otherwise victimized. So my guess is that all the fairies and dragons and flying whales and talking trees are merely servants of a higher power, and if the timeline is to be interpreted canonically, temporary servants at that, who come and go as they are needed, or are perhaps even shaped by the world itself, their natures transforming alongside the ever-mutating landscape as the aeons roll by. And to return to a previous topic, of Link's various adventures being a single story getting told and retold by countless orators, it's as though each version of Link simply charted his own path through that land. He doesn't interact with everything or visit every location in a given retelling, just as not every screen adaptation or collection of myths and fairy tales would include every nuanced detail and variation. Details would be altered depending on the speaker, the language, the culture, and, of course, for the sake of pacing. We will never hear all the tales about Odin, Osiris, Beowulf, or Odysseus, for instance. But if hundreds of different scholars independently decided to make records of their journeys, they would invariably choose to include different combinations of events in each retelling, and even different interpretations of the more ambiguous and arcane details. Similar characters would get morphed together for the sake of pacing. Perceived redundancies would likely be removed or compressed into footnotes. Assumptions could even be made about the traits, personalities, and origins of the less defined characters.
Now, this is exactly what the fans have been doing for decades with the Zelda franchise. I, of course, am no less guilty of this. If I poured the entire contents of my headcanon into a computer, I could make a brand new Zelda game out of it.
And I'm sure that's true for many of you who are watching this, because that's pretty much what game developers do with long-standing franchises. They force everything through a kind of kaleidoscope, recycling old themes, images, concepts, characters, songs, dungeons, maps, items, and even chunks of storyline, spewing out brand new games which feature the same old salad, but with everything in different proportions. Sometimes you get a more spicy game with lots of onion. Sometimes your game has too much lettuce and you're perpetually anticipating the flavor. And sometimes there is a really unlikely turn of the kaleidoscope and a previously understated element abruptly splashes to the surface, and you get an absolute masterpiece, with new mechanics and an interesting storyline that enriches your experience of the series as a whole.
That's basically how the creative process works. That's how I compose my music, it's how writers compose screenplays. Everything we make is a kaleidoscoped expression of things we've already perceived and experienced, whether or not we're conscious of it.
Of course, this isn't, or at least doesn't have to be a bad thing. True creativity is, after all, one's ability to effectively use that kaleidoscope function. Yes, this does mean that the things we love are often derivative and even pastiche, no matter how novel they seem, and yes, it does technically mean that some of what we deem canon versus non-canon is ultimately arbitrary, but this mixing process, I think, is still profound. After all, every new idea must come from somewhere, and we use whatever ingredients are available, innovating around hardware limitations, drawing inspiration and even revelation from something very deep and personal. Which sort of brings me to my earlier remarks about fan reception. As with many art forms, video games tend to receive higher praise and are overall more enjoyable when they seem to have been made with heart. And consumers of said media are often craving a sense of meaning. We want all the pieces to feel significant. We want everything to fit together. And we find ourselves most drawn to the elements which we perceive as ripest for interpretation. Nintendo caters to this inclination, and to a degree, so do many of its creative fans. Fantasy and myth, stories and legends are very much alive, as long as we feel inspired by them. And that means that Zelda fans are a part of the cosmic web. Because, as I've stated,
There is a different version of Hyrule within each of us. Entirely unique forests grown of a single seed, towering mountains formed of the same bedrock, delightfully varied lakes, replenished by one rainstorm.
Thanks for watching the 4th episode of my series. I may or may not be making more of these, but you can be sure that I'll continue creating Zelda-related stuff for many years to come.